The moment my aunt saw the name on the discharge summary, she stopped breathing for a second. Not a dramatic pause, a real one. The kind where your body forgets what it's supposed to do because your brain is too busy processing something it wasn't prepared for. She was standing at the nurse's station, still wearing her airport sandals, her tan fresh from 4 days in Scottsdale, demanding to know why she hadn't been listed as my emergency contact anymore. The floor nurse slid the visitor log across the counter without a word. My aunt's finger traced down the page. Same name. Every day. 4 times, sometimes twice in one evening. Her jaw tightened in a way I recognized from childhood. That's the look she got when something wasn't going her way and she hadn't figured out how to spin it yet. I wasn't there to see it. I was 3 floors up, learning how to walk a hallway with a physical therapist who kept telling me I was doing great in that cheerful way hospital staff use when they mean you're not doing great, but you're alive, so we'll take it. My name is Cecily. I'm 31 years old. I work as a long-haul freight auditor for a regional shipping company in Columbus, Ohio, which means I spend most of my days verifying that the numbers match. Weight, mileage, fuel cost, delivery windows. I am professionally someone who notices when things don't add up. The irony is that it took me almost a decade to apply that same scrutiny to my own family. In our house growing up, my cousin Brandon was the star. Younger than me by 4 years, effortlessly charming, the kind of person who could walk into a room and have everyone smiling before he said a word. My aunt and uncle, who raised us both after my parents died in a car accident when I was 9, treated Brandon the way some people treat a prize they've been waiting their whole lives to win. His baseball, his grades, his social life, everything was an event. Everything required investment. Everything needed support. I was the support. It started small, the way these things always do. I got a part-time job at 16 stocking shelves at a grocery store because my aunt said it would build character. Brandon didn't need to build character. Brandon didn't need to build character. Brandon needed to focus on his pitching arm. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I had a real salary and a budget I thought was mine, and a list of monthly transfers that belonged to everyone else. My uncle's out of pocket for his knee replacement. The gap between what Brandon's car insurance actually cost and what he told them it cost. The security deposit on my cousin's first apartment when he decided to move to Charlotte for a girl he'd met at a sports bar. I didn't track the total for a long time because tracking it felt like accusing them of something. My aunt had taken me in. She fed me and enrolled me in school and showed up for every parent-teacher conference. There was a ledger in my head I kept deliberately blurry. When I finally ran the numbers, the way I run numbers for work, the clear-eyed auditor version of myself, the total was just over $78,000 over 8 years, not counting what I'd lent and genuinely forgotten about, not counting the times I'd paid for family dinners without being asked. I told myself it was fine. That's what family does. That's what the people who took me in deserved. But I was tired in a way that didn't respond to sleep anymore. The morning it happened was a Tuesday in February, which felt appropriate because February in Ohio is the kind of month that doesn't apologize for anything. I'd worked the overnight audit shift, which I'd picked up voluntarily because my supervisor had a family emergency and I was covering. I'd been running on 4 hours of sleep for most of the week. My lunch that day was a granola bar I found in my coat pocket, and I couldn't remember putting it there, which told me it had been there a while. I was walking across the parking structure to my car when my legs stopped cooperating. That's the only way I know to describe it. 1 second I was moving, the next my knees buckled sideways and the concrete was coming up fast. I reached out and caught the edge of a car bumper, slid down it, and landed sitting up against someone's rear tire. I thought I'd tripped. I tried to stand up and couldn't. My hands were shaking in a way I couldn't control. A man in a heavy coat was loading boxes into his trunk 3 cars away. He saw me and jogged over, crouching down. He asked if I needed help. I said I was fine, which was not a thing a person sitting on parking structure, concrete in February is ever actually saying truthfully. He called 911 anyway. I want to thank him, whoever he was, because I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't. At the hospital, they told me I was severely dehydrated, that my blood pressure had dropped to a level that explained the collapse and that the EKG showed something that needed to be monitored. They used the word arrhythmia in a careful tone, the kind of tone where you understand they're calibrating how much to scare you. They admitted me and said they'd keep me for observation. Possibly a few days, possibly longer. I asked the intake nurse if she could contact my family. I gave her my aunt's number. My aunt arrived with my uncle and Brandon 2 hours later. Brandon was in his gym clothes, which meant he'd come from the gym, which meant he'd had time to go to the gym between getting the call and driving to the hospital. I noticed this in the way I notice things that don't quite add up, automatically, without meaning to. They stayed for an hour and 40 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock above the door, not because I was timing them, but because I was waiting for my heart monitor to stop beeping so loudly and the clock was something to look at that didn't beep. My aunt held my hand for about 15 minutes. My uncle asked 3 questions. Was this serious? Was I insured? And would I be able to work from home during recovery? Brandon sat in the chair by the window scrolling his phone and said, "That's rough," when my aunt nudged him. When they left, my aunt said she'd check in tomorrow. She kissed my forehead the way you kiss a child you're leaving with a babysitter. That night, I was moved to a monitored room on the cardiac floor, and I lay in the dark listening to the building breathe, and I thought about the number 78,000, and I thought about the granola bar in my coat pocket, and I thought about Brandon at the gym, and something in my chest that had nothing to do with arrhythmia started to ache. The next morning, a day nurse named Rosario checked my vitals and asked if I'd had many visitors. I said my family had come yesterday. She nodded in that way nurses nod when they're not reacting to the specific words you said. That evening, Rosario mentioned almost offhandedly, while adjusting my IV line, that someone had been by. A man hadn't come in, just stood in the hallway near my door for a while, then left. I assumed it was a wrong room situation. I didn't ask for details. On day 3, he came back. Rosario mentioned it again. Same thing. Stood outside, didn't knock. On day 4, I was awake late, the kind of awake that happens at 2 in the morning when your brain decides it has opinions it needs to share. The hallway light was low. I turned my head toward the window in the door, and there was a man standing on the other side of it, not looking in aggressively, not pressing his face to the glass. Just standing. Tall, in a dark jacket. Still in the way people get when they're trying not to take up space they're not sure they're allowed to take. I raised my hand. Just a small wave, more reflex than intention. He went very still. Then he nodded once, slowly. And he sat down in the chair against the wall outside my door, and I watched the top of his head through the door window for a while before I fell asleep. In the morning I asked Rosario directly. I said, "There's someone coming to this floor at night, not a patient. Who is he?" She looked at me for a moment, the look that means she was making a decision. Then she said his name. Kent Marlowe. I hadn't heard that name said out loud in 11 years. My aunt had made sure of that. When I was 20, I found a box in the storage room of my aunt's house. Shoe boxes stacked inside a larger box, and inside the shoe boxes were photographs, letters, receipts, and a birthday card that said in handwriting I didn't recognize, to Cecily on her first birthday, "Love always, Kent." There was a photograph of a man holding an infant in a hospital blanket, and the man had my nose. Or I had his. And there was a letter addressed to my aunt, dated about 8 months after my parents died, asking about my welfare and requesting regular visitation. I brought the box to my aunt, and she sat with it in her lap for a long moment. Then she told me that Kent Marlowe was a family complication, that he'd been involved with my mother before she married my father, that his claim to anything in our family was legally and emotionally irrelevant, that he had been made aware that contact was not welcome and had agreed to respect that. She said it the way someone reads from a document they've memorized, flat and final. I asked if he could be my father. She said my father was the man who raised me, meaning my dad who died when I was 9. She didn't answer the question I actually asked. I was 20 years old and she had taken me in when I was 9 and I didn't push. I put the box back where I found it and I didn't look for it again. Now I was 31, in a cardiac monitoring room in Columbus, Ohio, and a man named Kent Marlowe had been sitting outside my door every night without asking for anything. When he finally came in, it was day 5. Rosario had told him I was awake and aware, and that it was fine. He stood in the doorway the same way he'd stood in the hallway, carefully, like someone who understood that being invited is different from being welcome and was trying to figure out which one he was. He was older than the photograph, obviously, the kind of older where the face has settled into itself. He had my nose or I had his, same as the photograph. He said my name, Cecily, like he'd been saving it somewhere. I said, I know who you are. He didn't react with relief or eagerness. He just nodded once, steady. I said, why are you here? He said, because I heard you were alone. I asked him how he'd found out. He said he had a contact, someone who knew someone who worked in the building where my office was. He'd heard through what he called a very long chain of people that an employee had been taken out of the parking structure by ambulance. It had taken him 2 days to confirm it was me. I stared at him. You drove here from where? Louisville, he said. I did the math. That's 3 hours. He didn't say anything. He didn't point out that 3 hours was not actually that far. He just stood there and let the number sit between us. I said, my aunt is going to find out you're here. He said, I know. I said, she's not going to like it. He said quietly, she doesn't have to. And something in the delivery of that, not aggressive, not bitter, just calm, like a man who had made peace with a difficult truth a long time ago, something in that landed in my chest and stayed there. My aunt found out on day 7, through a nurse who didn't know the history and mentioned in passing that my regular evening visitor had been in again. My aunt drove to the hospital and appeared in my doorway in the same airport sandals she'd apparently been wearing on her way back from Scottsdale when she'd been diverted to confront this. She and my uncle had been in Scottsdale for a long weekend. Brandon had a recruitment showcase. A scout from a minor league affiliate had expressed interest, and my aunt had described this event in the weeks before like it was something that would appear in textbooks. I had wished Brandon luck genuinely. I liked my cousin in the way you can like someone who's been handed everything and doesn't notice, because the not noticing isn't cruelty, it's just blindness. But while I was on a cardiac monitor in Columbus, Ohio, they were at a resort in Arizona watching Brandon take batting practice for a scout. My aunt stood in the doorway and I watched her process the room, me in the bed, Kent in the chair he'd moved to the corner, the small paper cup of coffee he'd brought me from the machine down the hall still sitting on the tray table. Her eyes went to him, and her face did the thing I'd seen at the nurse's station, the freezing, the recalibration. What is he doing here? She said, not to Kent, to me. I said, visiting. She said, visiting isn't the word I'd use. I said, what would you use? Her voice dropped into the register she used for serious conversations, the one that meant I was about to be told something for my own good. Cecily, you don't know the history. You don't know the history. You don't know what he put our family through. I looked at her. I know he came every night for a week. She pulled her eyes away from Kent and fixed them on me. I came. I've been here. You were in Scottsdale, I said, not unkindly, just accurately. Her expression shifted. Brandon needed support. So did I said. It landed the way I meant it to, not a shout, not an accusation, just a fact presented in the same neutral tone I use when I find a discrepancy in a freight invoice. She opened her mouth, and then my uncle appeared behind her in the doorway, taking up the frame with his shoulders, looking first at Kent and then at me with the expression he reserved for situations where money was about to be a topic. What's going on? He said. I said, I'd like you both to come in and close the door. They did, which surprised me. My aunt sat in the chair near the window. My uncle stood, arms crossed. Kent stayed in his corner quietly, which I appreciated. I said, I need to tell you some things, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. My aunt's jaw set. She nodded. I said, I have been the financial backstop for this family for 8 years. I have a spreadsheet. The total is $78,000. I am not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because I've been pretending it was fine and it's not fine, and I collapsed in a parking structure, and I'd been here for a week. And the financial pipeline you have access to ends when I leave this building. My uncle said that's family, that's what family does. I said yes, I agree. And while I was here, family showed up every night, sat outside a glass door, and didn't ask for a single thing. The room went the way rooms go when something true and inconvenient has been said in them. Quiet and slightly airless. My aunt looked at Kent. She said, "You don't have a right to be here." Kent said, "She's a grown woman." "I'm not sure that's your call to make." My aunt's voice went sharp. "You were never part of her life. You don't get to walk in now." I said, "He walked in because he heard I was alone. I'm asking myself why you didn't." My aunt turned back to me and I saw something behind the composure then. Not guilt exactly. Something more complicated. The expression of a person who has been telling a story for so long that they've stopped questioning whether it's the whole story. She said, "I did everything for you. After your parents died, I took you in, I raised you." I said, "You did, and I'm grateful." And somewhere along the way, gratitude became obligation, and obligation became a financial agreement that only moved in one direction. My uncle said, "After everything we did." I said, "I know what you did, and I know what I did. I have documentation for both." He went quiet. Numbers have a way of doing that to people. My aunt looked at Kent again, and something in her expression changed. Less anger, more something older. Fear, maybe, or the particular exhaustion of a person who knows a conversation is coming that they've been avoiding for 2 decades. She said, "Kent has no legal claim." I said, "I'm not asking about legal claims. I'm asking about the letters he sent. The ones asking about me when I was 9 and 10 and 11. I found them when I was 20, and you told me he was a complication." I want to know what that meant. The room held its breath. My aunt said, "Your mother and I agreed." I said, "My mother has been dead for 22 years. I'm asking you." She looked down at her hands. She had my grandmother's hands, wide-palmed and practical, the kind that were always doing something. For once they were just sitting. She said, "He was your mother's first love, before your father. They were together for almost 3 years. When your parents got together, he and your mother agreed to close that chapter. He respected that. He moved away. He built a different life." She stopped. I said, "And?" She said, "When your parents died, he reached out. He wanted to be in your life. He thought, because of the timing, because of certain things your mother had said to him before she passed, he thought there was a possibility that he was—" She stopped again. This time it was a longer stop. I said, "My father." She said very quietly, "We didn't know for certain. We still don't. Your parents were together and there was overlap at the beginning, and it was never tested because your father was your father in every way that mattered, and after he died I saw no reason to." Kent said from his corner gently, "I asked for a test." "In the letters." My aunt's jaw tightened. She said, "I know." I said, "You said no." She didn't answer. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the box in the storage room, the birthday card. To Cecily on her first birthday, the handwriting I didn't recognize because nobody had ever let me learn it. I said, "I want the test." My aunt said, "Cecily." I said, "I'm 31 years old and I'm in a cardiac monitoring room and I have spent a significant portion of my adult income keeping this family functional and I have asked for very little. I'm asking for this." My uncle said, "This doesn't change anything." I said, "It changes some things." He looked at Kent, then at me, then at the door, with the expression of a man calculating his options and not finding many. He said, "We'll talk about this at home." I said, "You can talk about it wherever you'd like. I'm going to do it." My aunt stood. She straightened her jacket in the way she always straightened her jacket when she wanted to signal that a conversation was finished. She said, "We'll be back tomorrow." I said, "You don't need to be." She paused. "What?" I said, "The emergency contact form is already updated. The hospital has everything it needs. You don't need to come back tomorrow." Her face moved through several expressions quickly. She said, "We're your family." I said, "I know. and I'll sort out what that means when I'm out of here. Right now, I'm asking you to leave." I had expected it to feel bigger, louder. In the version of this moment I'd imagined, I'd said something devastating, or my voice shook, or my aunt crumbled, or my uncle softened, or something dramatic happened that made the whole thing feel like a scene. But it was just 4 people in a hospital room, and then 2 of them walked out. The door clicked shut. The quiet that came after was the kind that isn't empty. It was full of everything I hadn't said yet, and everything I was starting to understand, and the sound of my heart monitor continuing its steady, unremarkable work of proving I was still here. Kent stayed in his corner. He didn't try to fill the silence. After a while, I said, "I might be wrong about you." He said, "You might be." I said, "This might be a very complicated situation that doesn't resolve neatly." He said, "It probably is." I said, "I still want the test." He said, "So do I." I looked at him across the room, this stranger with my nose who had driven 3 hours from Louisville and sat outside a glass door for a week without asking for anything. And I thought about the birthday card in the shoebox, and about the number 78,000, and about the granola bar in my coat pocket. And I thought about how I had spent most of my adult life being careful and responsible and available, and I had collapsed in a parking structure in February because my body eventually presents the invoice. I said, "Whoever you turn out to be, thank you for coming." He said, "I should have come sooner." I said, "You tried." He looked out the window. Columbus in February doesn't offer much. Gray sky, bare trees, the particular flatness of Midwestern winter. He looked at it like it was fine. Like he was just glad to be looking at something from a chair he'd been invited to sit in. 3 weeks after discharge, I was at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a letter from a DNA testing service, and Kent was on the other end of a phone call neither of us had spoken much during. He was giving me the space to open it without narrating anything. I opened it. The number was the kind that doesn't leave room for interpretation. I sat with it for a minute. Then I said his name, Kent. He said, "Yeah." I said, "It's you." He breathed out, a long breath, the kind that has been held for 31 years. Outside my window, the trees were starting to figure out what they were supposed to do next, bare branches with the first faint suggestion of green at the tips. Not there yet, but coming. I thought about my aunt and the box in the storage room, and the letters she'd kept from me, and the 22 years of a simple question she decided I didn't need answered. I thought about what I owed her for the years of care and what she owed me for the years of silence. And I thought maybe those were 2 separate ledgers that didn't have to balance against each other. I thought about $78,000, and I thought about a granola bar, and I thought about a man sitting outside a glass door every night saying nothing, asking for nothing, just refusing to let me be alone. When you spent your whole life making yourself useful, you stop knowing how to recognize what care looks like when it doesn't need anything from you. You've been so trained to earn your place that real belonging feels foreign. Suspicious, even, like something you shouldn't trust because you haven't paid for it yet. I'm still figuring that out, but I know where to start. I keep thinking about the granola bar in my coat pocket, the one I couldn't remember putting there. That detail stays with me more than the hospital ceiling or the beeping monitor or even the moment I opened that envelope and saw the number that changed everything. The granola bar is what I come back to because it's the clearest evidence of what I had let happen to myself. Not all at once, but slowly. One skipped meal and one covered expense and one just this once at a time. There's a version of my story where I'm the villain, where I resent people who loved me the best way they knew how, where I weaponize a spreadsheet to punish a family that took me in when I had nowhere to go. I've sat with that version. I think you have to if you're going to be honest with yourself. My aunt did raise me. She showed up for things. The care was real. And the taking was also real. Both of those things are true and they don't cancel each other out. What I come to understand is that what happened to me wasn't the result of anyone being a monster. It was the result of a pattern that nobody interrupted. I was useful, so I was used. I was grateful, so I was quiet. I was responsible, so I was given more responsibility. And each of those things felt, in the moment, like a reasonable exchange. The problem is that reasonable exchanges, compounded over 8 years, can still leave you sitting on a parking structure floor in February, unable to stand up. That's the thing about quietly carrying too much. Your body will eventually present the invoice even when your pride won't let you. Kent taught me something without meaning to. He drove 3 hours and sat outside a glass door without asking for recognition, without demanding that I feel a certain way about it, without making his presence into a transaction. He just showed up, and in doing that, he demonstrated something I hadn't seen modeled for me in a long time, that real integrity doesn't need an audience. It doesn't keep a ledger. It doesn't offer care as currency and then collect on the debt. I've thought a lot about who I want to be on the other side of all this. Not just what I want to stop doing, but what I want to actually build. I think being a decent person, the kind who does right by others without using that decency as leverage, requires something most people underestimate. It requires knowing yourself clearly enough to see when you're being taken advantage of and being strong enough to say so without burning everything down out of anger. Those two things, the clarity and the steadiness, don't come automatically. I had to collapse in a parking structure to start developing them. I would have preferred a less dramatic classroom. But here I am, 31 years old, with a DNA result and a closed bank account, and a father I'm just beginning to know, and a family I'm still sorting out how to love from a safer distance. The trees outside my window are getting their leaves back. I'm getting something back too. I'm not sure yet what to call it, but it feels, for the first time in a long time, like mine.